The half century from 1930 to about 1980 witnessed a transformation in the character of federal-state-local relations in the United States. Just prior to the Great Depression, 1929, the state and local governments combined were spending 3 times as much as the federal government on all purposes in government. By the late 1970s, the federal government had grown by 9 times as a percentage of GNP, and it spent considerably more on aid to states and localities than it had spent on all purposes in 1929, measured as a percentage of GNP, rather than measured simply as in terms of dollars. The expansion of federal aid to states and cities occurred primarily in 2 spurts. First during the 1930s, which we won't talk about tonight, then from 1960 to 1980. From 1960 to 1980, federal grants adjusted for inflation grew by more than 4 times in real terms. The states and localities were increasing their revenue sources from their own sources at this time, but their reliance on federal aid nearly doubled. By 1980, federal aid accounted for more than 1/4 of total state-local revenue, and federal and state aid combined accounted for about 45% of local revenue in the United States. Well, federal aid in real terms actually peaked in 1978, early in the Carter administration. There were some slight declines thereafter. But during the early Reagan years, federal aid went into free fall. From 1980 to 1983, it declined by 17% in real terms. Since then, there have actually been some very slight increases in real terms, but federal aid as a share of GNP has continued to decline. And today, federal aid is only 2/3 as a share of GNP what it was in 1978. It's fallen from 3.6% of gross national product to 2.4% of gross national product. During the middle and late 1980s, the impact of this set of federal cuts was masked by the national economic boom, which allowed states and localities to offset much of the federal cutbacks by increasing their own revenues without, for the most part, having to increase taxes significantly. And some states were even fortunate enough, as this state was, to cut taxes, even as very large increases in spending were taking place. But with the current national recession, we're witnessing real spending cutbacks, more severe than any since the very early Reagan years, and those were the only cutbacks of this magnitude experienced since the Great Depression. The current cuts are not federally imposed, of course. Federal aid is roughly stable at the current time, but neither has the administration made any effort to increase federal aid or to make any countercyclical spending moves. Nor, given the budget agreement of last fall, does it seem likely that they will in the near future. Well, our concern today is with the seriousness of the fiscal crisis that has resulted from the current economic downturn, plus the historic decline of federal aid during the course of the 1980s. And we have a very distinguished panel which will address such questions as the following. How serious are the consequences of the current wave of spending cutbacks? And what should be done? Can the federal government continue to practice what Mario Cuomo and others have called fend-for-yourself federalism? Do the states have any choice but to practice their own brand of Reaganism at this time in American history? Can the nation's cities cope with the severe challenges they face in the environment of drastically reduced federal aid since the early 80s and state aid now since the late 80s? The format this evening will be as follows. I will briefly introduce the panel right now. I'll ask each panelist to make remarks lasting about 5 minutes. Then we'll have an informal conversation up here. And then, roughly 45, 50 minutes from now, we'll go out to you, the audience, and we'll have some interaction with you. Our panelists are as follows. Ray Flynn, as I'm sure just about everyone here knows, is currently in his 8th year as the mayor of Boston. He previously served as a Massachusetts state representative from 1971 to 1978 and as a Boston city councilman from 1978 to 83. In gaining election to his second term as mayor in 1987, he received the largest majority of any mayoral candidate in many years, 67%, and he is an overwhelming favorite to be reelected this year. Mayor Flynn is currently vice president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. He is scheduled to be elected president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors in June. They don't have contested elections at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And finally, although it is not highlighted in his political ads, I should note that Mayor Flynn has his master's degree in education from Harvard University. Maxine Waters, on my right, is a new member of Congress, having been elected last November with, listen to this, Mayor, 80% of the vote in her last Los Angeles district. From 1976 to 1990, she was a member of the California State Assembly, where she rose to chair the Assembly's Democratic Caucus, in addition to a number of other distinctions there. She also gained national eminence for her successful legislative campaigns and national activism on behalf of such issues as state pension fund divestment from businesses involved in South Africa, child abuse prevention, and state contracting goals for doing business with minority and women-owned firms. Edward DuPont, on my left, is the new president of the New Hampshire State Senate this year, and the lone Republican official on our panel. I assured him, and I will assure you, that we had hoped for somewhat greater balance. Former Governor Jim Thompson of Illinois was scheduled to be on this panel, but had to cancel a couple of days ago. Senator DuPont is now in his fifth Senate term. He's also been a member of the City Council and the Planning Board in his hometown of Rochester, New Hampshire. And in the fashion of part-time New Hampshire politicians, he's also a businessman. He's the president of a heating fuel distribution company based in Rochester. Helen Sonny Ladd, far to my right, is currently a professor of public policy at Duke University. Sonny is a nationally respected specialist in state-local finance. She's written widely on the property tax, on education finance, on tax and expenditure limitations, and on the fiscal problems of American cities, and she's a former member of this Kennedy School faculty. Her most recent book, co-authored with John Yinger, is entitled America's Ailing Cities, Fiscal Health and the Design of Urban Policy, which came out in 1989, but I gather a paperback is just about to be available, so those of you who are cheapskates can now get your copy of that book by Ladd and Yinger. Sonny, why don't you lead off, perhaps, with a few observations on the scope and magnitude of fiscal stress as you've been finding it in your research across the country.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan, and I'm delighted to be here tonight. I'll focus on the last question that you asked. Can cities cope with this changing system of federalism that we're now dealing with? The related question is, should they be asked to cope, or should we be turning back to the state government and to the federal government and asking for more assistance for cities? Clearly, many cities throughout the country are facing serious fiscal problems right now. We're all aware of the catastrophic budgetary situation in Philadelphia right now. We've read about the problems of New York and Washington and many other cities throughout the country. The first point I'd like to make is that these problems that we read about in the press today are problems that reflect underlying or structural problems in the ability of cities to finance public services. When the media talks about them, we tend to think that this is a short-run budgetary problem that may reflect financial mismanagement or the consequences of the current recession. My own sense, based on the work that I've been doing with John Yinger, is that there's a much more fundamental or structural cause to these current problems. The changes or the social and economic trends that we're all aware of, suburbanization of employment, of middle and upper income people, concentration of low-income people in the cities, problems of AIDS and teenage mothers and out-of-wedlock mothers, problems of drugs, have all changed the fiscal situation in many large cities throughout the country and have made it increasingly difficult for cities to provide adequate public services to their residents at reasonable tax burdens. Now, I think it's important to take this more structural approach, this question that forces one to think about the difficulty of providing adequate services at reasonable tax burdens, because when you do take that approach, you start beginning to recognize that it's these external pressures, these external trends outside the control of city officials that are at the heart of many of the current problems that we're seeing in cities. And as Alan mentioned in his remarks, some of the effects of these trends may have been masked in the past, certainly in the 1970s. In my work, I looked at the period in the 70s as well as in the 80s, and these trends were present then. Some of them were offset or masked in part by additional federal or state aid to cities. And what we've been seeing in the 1980s now is a dramatic cutback in that federal aid, and so the consequences of these structural trends is coming to the fore. Now, the policy consequences of this are important. If you think the problems of cities reflect short-term financial mismanagement or just current budget deficits, you tend to turn to the cities themselves to look for solutions. Why can't you set up a better accounting system? Why can't you have performance evaluation? Why can't you keep better track of the numbers of employees you have? If, on the other hand, you take this more structural approach in thinking about the problem, you begin to realize that it's difficult for many cities, not all cities, for many cities to cope with these problems. And they shouldn't be asked to cope with them, because coping with them means providing inadequate levels of public services or imposing very high tax rates on city residents. So the policy focus then shifts to the need for additional outside assistance to cities from higher levels of government. Without that assistance, many cities throughout the country will be unable to provide adequate public services to their residents at reasonable tax burdens. Now, the question is, where should this assistance come from? Actually, let me just back up 1 minute. I don't mean to imply from this that cities shouldn't be encouraged to do as much as they can to help themselves. I certainly don't want to suggest that some of the management sorts of reforms that Mayor Flynn has introduced in Boston are not worthwhile. They certainly are, and cities should be continued to be pressured to improve their managerial systems, their performance evaluation, their accounting systems, whatever. In addition, cities should be encouraged to do whatever they can to expand the economic base of the city. My point, though, is even if cities use all the tools that are available to them, managerial tools, economic development tools, the lesson that comes out of the work that John Yinger and I've been doing is that there will still be major disparities across this country, that some cities will be able to provide adequate services at reasonable tax rates and other cities will not. This is what leads me to push for additional assistance from higher levels of government. So then the question is, from what level of government should this additional assistance come? Well, much of it can and should, I believe, come from the state governments. Now, the reason I make that assertion is that the states are the ones that set the rules within which the cities operate. It's the states that determine which taxes cities are allowed to use. Boston, for example, is not allowed to use a sales tax or an earnings tax, only a property tax. It's states that determine the division of responsibilities among state and local governments. And these institutional factors can have a big impact on how cities are able to cope with these stronger economic and social forces that they're dealing with. So as we think about this additional assistance, I think it's important to realize that states can and should play a large role, and that the assistance from state governments is not only in the form of monetary aid, but in addition in the form of changing fiscal institutions, empowering cities perhaps to levy additional taxes or taking over certain service responsibilities. Having said that, though, my own strongly held view and that of my co-author, John Yinger, is that there's still an important role role for the federal government to play in assisting cities. And we would certainly like to see the federal government play a larger role. There are a number of reasons for this. The first is the large number of poor and disadvantaged households in cities. And any economic analyst and many other policy analysts would tell you that it's appropriate for the highest level of government, in this case the federal government, to take primary responsibility for assisting poor people. Another justification for federal involvement is that many of the pressures that I've been talking about that lead to fiscal pressures in the city reflect national trends. Increasing out-of-wedlock births, increase in drug use, increase in violence, suburbanization of unemployment these days. Given that these are national trends that are having adverse effects on the fiscal conditions of cities, it makes sense to have the federal government play some role in trying to offset the worst effects of those trends. And then finally, if the responsibility were left completely to the states to deal with the fiscal problems of large U.S. cities, some states would obviously be able to do a better job than other states just because their own fiscal health is strong and they would have the ability to help cities. And given this variation across states in their ability and also their willingness to help cities, it seems to us that it's appropriate for the federal government to play a role. Now, my one final comment has to do with the nature of the federal assistance and of the state assistance. Our research shows that not all cities have serious fiscal problems. Some of them, especially a lot of the cities in the South and the West, have strong fiscal health. Given the budgetary pressures facing both the federal government and many state governments throughout the country now, I think it would be irresponsible to keep going back to the state governments and the federal government saying we need more money for all cities. I think the goal at this stage has to be cost effectiveness. And my notion of cost effectiveness in this context is saying, look, some cities need help, others don't. A cost-effective assistance program would be one that targets aid to the cities that need it the most. Thank you.
Thank you. Among our practitioners who constitute the rest of our panel, we have a federal official, although not necessarily empowered to speak for the administration, a state official and a local official. We're going to go in that order. Congressman Waters, Congresswoman Waters.
Thank you very much. Let me start by saying the state of California has a budget shortfall of about 13 to 15 billion dollars.
That's reassuring to us here in Massachusetts.
Let me also say that I think that the previous comments are absolutely correct. Much of what you see happening in the cities has nothing to do with mismanagement or the reordering of priorities. We have national trends and national policies that have caused us to see some of the devastation that we're seeing in these cities, and the so-called inner cities in particular. I think it was back in 1981 when Reagan had his famous or infamous Tax Reform Act, where basically many of the industries of this country were allowed to get involved in the selling of tax credits and other kinds of things that was supposed to lead to a capital investment in the state-of-the-art equipment for their factories and industries, and thus it would make them more productive and put more people to work, etc. That did not happen. The companies, for the most part, took the money and ran, exported the jobs to third world countries for cheap labor markets, and you see many of the cities that once had opportunities in these factories where you had plants such as Goodyear and Libyon's Glass and General Electric, etc., simply closed down those plants, and many of those persons who worked for and worked in those plants have never worked again, have simply never worked again, and certainly their sons and daughters did not have the opportunity to get those jobs in the plants that were good paying jobs. Many of the young people in these inner cities whose fathers and mothers were in labor unions and worked in these jobs are hanging out on the street corners with no real possibility of perhaps ever working in their lifetime. And so no matter what the city would do in terms of its management responsibilities, it can't do anything about supplying jobs for all of these unemployed young men and women in these inner cities. The states, many of whom started programs because of sometimes dishonest politicians and politics in general, to reduce the tax responsibilities of its citizens. In California, we're guilty. We had Proposition 13. I think somewhere else it was Proposition 2.5, and on and on and on. And politicians jockeying to see how they could present themselves as crusaders to reduce the tax responsibility of the citizens with no thought for what it was doing. In the state of California, because of Proposition 13, we took on serious responsibility for continuing a flow of dollars in the early years to the cities and to the counties to provide services. The state of California is now broke, and it can't do that. And I suspect some other cities are in the same, some other states are in the same position. I expect the federal government to help the cities. And I don't expect the federal government to help the cities by block granting to the states. Many states are so broke they're going to steal the money, and it's never going to flow to the cities. When you look at the state of California with the problems that they have, it's going to be very difficult to talk about block granting to the state of California and think that money is ever going to get down to the cities where it's supposed to go. We have that problem in relationship to the city, to the states and the counties. State of California in funding counties have a problem. We don't know what the counties are doing with the money. They take the money off the top. Many states talked about block granting to the counties, and we lose programs that our more conservative colleagues never wanted in the first place. If you take federal programs and you throw them into a block grant, you're literally saying we're washing our hands of it. Now, you take this limited money, $15 billion in the case of the federal government, and you go out, you do whatever you want to do with it. It's your problem now. Well, one of the reasons you saw the escalation of federal assistance in the years that was described earlier is that we all believe, I think, that if you're poor, if you're hungry, if you are a senior citizen, there are some things that everybody deserves to have equally, whether you're in Mississippi or whether you're in California. And federal government protected programs have the ability to fund these services in ways that will at least give equal opportunity across the board. In addition to that, the federal government, despite the deficit, is the only entity, in my estimation, with any real dollars to spend. One would ask, well, how can that be true with the deficit that you're experiencing? We still have to look at the obscene defense budget, the military budget, and instead of turning our heads to the fact that we're probably going to be in a replenishing mood, given we're just coming out of the Persian Gulf, we should still be looking at this budget for investment in human potential. I maintain that it is absolutely ludicrous for us to be in a situation where we can rise to the occasion for war no matter what the amounts are, and no matter how it is described in terms of what our allies should or maybe will be paying for. The fact of the matter is the citizens of this country will bear the burden of the cost of that war and replenishing the armaments for future wars. And I just think it is a place that we must continue to look for dollars and make the case for investment of those dollars in human potential. Let me just finally say, thank you. Let me just finally say that in many of the inner cities, you will find that increasingly they are centers of diversity, where you have African Americans, you have people from Central America, you have people from the Middle East, everywhere. We have a policy, an immigration policy in this country, people coming from Mexico every day. And we have policies in this country of allowing people to come into this country. I don't know what people think is going to happen to them once they get here. These people increasingly are in these inner cities. The federal government's removing itself from responsibility for these inner cities is coming at a time when it appears that the cities are more inhabited by people of color. And that raises some serious questions in my mind and in the minds of others who are trying to do public policy. When the federal government removes itself from that responsibility, I don't know how it expects the cities or the states to absorb these huge costs. Let me just say the debate will rage about this potential block grant. I'm a little bit disappointed in the governors and even those in the Conference of State Legislatures who have come up with a little proposal to try and identify in some way with the administration's request to do block granting. I don't think it works, and I think the mayors should really fight very hard. I know some members of Congress will. And for those of us who are new, who represent inner cities and who come from a very progressive background, we're going to do more than fight. We're going to scream very loudly about this proposal. And hopefully we can undo the Budget Reconciliation Act of the previous year that does not allow us to transfer money from one category to the other, and try and have a principled position on crime, for example, and how to get rid of it, how to invest some money in it, and how to really invest some money in education, and thus create some real opportunity and get us out of the problems that we see in our cities. I think it's shameful in America, and hopefully, if there's anything that I can do over the next few years, it's to be involved in the development of public policy that will cause us to do what we really can do and what we really should do.
Senator DuPont.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. I was thinking on the way down that a couple of years ago to venture down to Massachusetts as a Republican was something that we in New Hampshire didn't really take too kindly to, and today it's enlightened to be a Republican in Massachusetts, so it is a pleasure to be here. As I previously was introduced, I thought that my experience as a state legislator, as a city councilor, was pretty good planning for where I find myself in my career at the present time. When we look at the whole issue of federalism, I get drawn back to an editorial that I saw in State Government News recently, where they talked about the whole issue of federalism in terms of household budgets, which is simple economics, that in recent years, in past years, when we talked about federalism, it was the head of the household sending the son or the daughter to the grocery store with a list and with the money to buy groceries. And when they got all through buying the groceries with the money that the head of household had given them, they took their own money and they bought something with it. Now, under the new federalism, we get the grocery list, we being the states and the local communities, the mandates of what the federal government wants us to do, but we go to the grocery store with our own money. And that, to me, is the essence of what the debate needs to center on when we talk about federalism. In New Hampshire right now, we're at the start of the war between the local communities, and I sympathize with Mayor Flynn in his dealings with the legislature, that our local communities are walking around with their representatives in our State House with badges that say, don't downshift the deficit. Because ultimately, as we look at our form of government, and I'm not going to be critical of Congresswoman Waters because she just ventured to Washington, but it's systematic that what we ultimately end up doing is we place the burden further down the ladder when we fail to meet our obligations. What's interesting about New Hampshire, and there's just one statistic that I'll leave you with, because I don't want to bore you with the numbers. We now have reached the point in our state where our largest revenue source, which is our business profits tax, no longer is capable of paying our Medicaid cost. It amounts to 20% of our total dollars raised in local government, in state government, but in essence it no longer can fund just that one program. That's not a reflection on whether or not I think Medicaid is good or bad, but it's indicative of the pressures that the states now find themselves in, trying to deal with their own priorities and the priorities that have been handed to them. Back in the early 80s, our citizens, who are known for the distrust of government and politicians, and as Alan indicated, we're a volunteer legislature. I get paid $100 a year for being a state senator and another $25 for being Senate president because of my added responsibilities. and there would be those that say that we're overpaid or that they're only paying us what we're worth. But that basically it's symbolic of the distrust that we have in New Hampshire for government as a whole. The New Hampshire citizenry, in their wisdom in 1984, by a 2/3 vote, during our general election, passed a constitutional amendment, number 28A. And in essence, what it said was that if our state government passed any program that sent a cost back to the local communities or county government, if we modified a program, if we took any action that ultimately resulted in a cost to a local community or a county government, that we had to send the dollars along with it. That's dealing with policy the way it should be dealt with at the federal level. If the federal government wants to tell the states that they're going to do something, then they ought to consider the fiscal impact of it. It's kept us honest, and every piece of legislation gets the test, and I will tell you that the local governments don't hesitate to come before our legislature and point the finger and say, that's unacceptable. And it allows and has forced us to think about the impact, the fiscal impact, when we do policy issues. You know, there's been a lot of debate in recent months about a constitutional amendment to restore state powers, and that's part of the whole debate over federalism. And many times I've said in the past that if we're going to talk about restoring states' powers, that we also ought to talk about putting in place a federal amendment to our Constitution that would force Congress's hand to practice the same type of fiscal restraint that the states and local governments have to practice. As I said earlier, there is a war starting in New Hampshire, the battle between the state, who has not enough resources to pay for its programs, and the local communities who ultimately bear the burden of what happens when states can't meet their obligations. Congressman Waters, the $15 billion that you mentioned as a deficit in California would run our state for 5 years. So that's an interesting number. One final point, and you know, I do agree with the whole issue of federalism, because I believe firmly that our states and our local governments can manage more effectively than the federal government, and that any program that the federal government runs, for the most part, with the exception of defense and a couple of others, can be managed more effectively at the state level. But what has happened in the 80s is interesting, because not only have the states received the short end of the federal dollars in terms of what we now receive, the federal government has kept the taxing ability and raised the money, but ultimately the states have gotten a smaller share. And what it's forced the states into is a situation where they can no longer invest in themselves. You know, we're looking at the whole issue of economic development in New Hampshire, and we're starting to realize that when you talk economic development, you talk investment in your infrastructure, you talk about investment in your education systems, and investment in your workforce. And because of the squeeze that's ongoing, we can no longer afford to do the types of things that will help lift us out of this recession that we find ourselves in. In closing, again, I'm not pointing any fingers, but I would welcome any U.S. Senator or Congresswoman or Congressman to come to New Hampshire during our budget deliberations and help us balance our budgets, because that to them would be a real dose of reality, because the battle is being waged at the local level right now, and it's not a pleasant one.
Thank you. Mayor Flynn, we're particularly grateful to Mayor Flynn for showing up here tonight. He's got both a cold and practicing for the marathon. I guess he hurt his ribs the other day as well, and so we have you in your semi-invalid state, but we're delighted to have you nonetheless.
Let me thank you all and people here for joining us here tonight. The timing of this issue could not be more appropriate in my particular case, because I'm just today submitted a fiscal 1992 budget to the Boston City Council, and we're reviewing the state's fiscal 1992 budget as well, and the federal government is dealing with their situation, so the timing is very, very appropriate. And I'll tell you why I think it's so significant in terms of the awareness that is going to be focused on this issue all across this country. We know the statistics around the federal retreat of services and programs at the city level, whether it be in the area of housing, which has been the largest domestic cut of the federal budget in 10 years, 75% cut in the federal budget regarding housing. We know the cuts in community development block grant, revenue sharing, job training programs, education, you name it, economic development. Those are very, very apparent to all of us. So there has been a massive retreat by the federal government towards the cities of our country. Well, that was somewhat, in a significant way, offset over the years by the state governments, whether it be New York, whether it be Boston, California, whatever the case may be, even under Proposition 13 in California or Proposition 2.5 here in Massachusetts, the state government came to the assistance by complementing and supplementing the loss of money that was being cut from the federal government and in property taxes through increases in local aid. And while federal money was dropping significantly over this period of time, correspondingly, the state government was providing increases in local aid. Well, for the last 2.5 years, however, that situation has changed, and changed dramatically. And the state government now is, and also the recession, has decided that they're going to cut back on local aid to cities and towns, not only here in Massachusetts, but we did a survey of state governments across the country, and we find the same situation taking place. As federal dollars are being cut, state dollars at the same time are being cut, forcing the local communities, and I think it's very important to point this out because it's really not just the cities. We will literally have 2/3 of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts operating at a deficit in fiscal year 1992 because of the fact that the financial problem at the state level is being shifted to the local cities and towns. So we're facing a challenge here where there has to be a new approach to the financing of local governments. And I wish we had a majority of people in Congress, like our Congresswoman here today, who felt a federal responsibility to help poor and needy working families in our communities, in our cities. Unfortunately, that is not the prevailing attitude in my experience in Congress. Many of those pleas, whether they're raised by officials from New York or Philadelphia or Chicago or Baltimore or wherever, are falling on dead ears and deaf ears in Washington. And so therefore, now that we no longer have a partner with the state government, there has to be a new creative approach as to how we're going to save and survive as cities and as communities that are going to continue to play a vital, helpful, positive role in the economy of in the livability of American urban life. I suspect right now this is more of a political issue that has to be dealt with. The American people have to come to the realization of what is taking place. They have to decide whether or not they think it's important to have strong urban America, or are they going to allow the cities of America further erode, decay, and crumble. If Philadelphia is any indication of what's happening, and when the federal government is ignoring their concerns, Harrisburg is ignoring their concerns, if New York City is any indication of it, where the federal government is ignoring their concerns, Albany is ignoring their concerns, if Boston is going to be any indication of it, where the federal government is ignoring their concerns, and we're now beginning to see the state government, the state legislature, and the Beacon Hill ignoring their concerns, we're going to see very, very serious problems for America's cities. I think it's a question of will. Are the people of America committed to the poor, the needy, the working families of our cities? If they are, they're going to have to make their point clear. They're going to have to let their voice be heard. If they sit back and allow this to happen, there isn't a very positive future for the cities of our country. I'm sorry to report here tonight.
I think Mayor Flynn and Congressman Waters have both pointed out that in very large part, I think what we're seeing is a retreat from programs that are perceived as the primary benefit to the poor and perhaps racial minorities in our society as well. The cities are victims of this because they house such a large proportion of the poor in this country. I guess one of the questions that I would ask the panel to consider is whether in trying to build a political coalition to address some of these issues, the issue has to be framed overwhelmingly in terms of compassion and morality, or are there ways of framing the issue in terms of the self-interest of the larger collectivity of the American people? Sort of a coalition-building question, and I'd be interested if any of the panelists would care to address that issue.
I'll take a stab at it, and I'd be interested to hear what the Congresswoman has to say as well. Put it this way, the comments that were made by the Congresswoman from California, as appropriate and as sensitive as they are, they've been said before on a number of occasions by a number of very committed public officials. And I might add that those messages have not had an impact on federal policy in Washington. I know it certainly has been raised by a number of mayors as well as a number of advocates on behalf of the poor and needy in communities across the country. So I think the federal government has been able effectively to ignore those concerns. I would take it in a different step. While we have to continue to highlight those inequities that are taking place and those injustices that are taking place in our society today, we also have to deal from a position of strength, however. We have to make sure that people in Washington understand how critically important the economic health of cities are to the American economy. You just look at Boston and the enormous influence financially that it plays in the Massachusetts, if not the entire New England regional economy. It is extraordinary in terms of jobs, in terms of industry, culture, medicine, education. We have 52% of the property in Boston is tax exempt. We are a city that its population more than doubles each day at 9 o'clock because of people coming in from the suburbs working in our city. So while we're reaching out to people of goodwill on the issue of fairness, we also have to deal from a position of strength and making sure that it is not in the economic health or the economic interest of Massachusetts or the country to see the cities go down the tube.
Well, let me just say, I think the mayor is correct. When we talk about these problems in ways that challenge policymakers to deal with morality and to deal with fairness, we probably won't get anywhere because we have seen in recent times that the fairness question has not caused any great change in attitude I think it is important to talk about the economic health of the country, but I'm not so sure that plays as well as one would think it would play. And let's look at it this way. Today there was a hearing in banking where we had a number of people representing an association that had been involved in providing goods and services for Iraq. And the question came up whether or not they understood that some of what they was doing was responsible for Iraq's ability to have chemical warfare. And what did that mean to them? And whether or not they even thought this perhaps may not be a good thing to do, to make money off of a country that was arming itself to the teeth and producing chemical warfare, that perhaps it was not moral to want to make money off of them. Well, they kind of looked at me as if to say, well, don't you understand business? We're in the business to make money. I tell you that story because as I watched what the business community has done to America, I'm appalled. High-standing citizens under the banner of the red, white, and blue flag in the Chamber of Commerce's and other business associations around this country have literally dismantled America, in my estimation. And they have not only exported jobs to third world countries for cheap labor markets, they have literally said we cannot manufacture anymore, that we're a service economy, that we can't make steel, that it's better done in Korea and other places, that the Japanese can manufacture better than we can. So they have literally removed this economy from the ability to provide jobs, the ability to make and do things, and they've made a lot of money off of it. And so I'm not so sure that the argument in the way that the mayor's framing it is one that will get attention. I do know one thing. I don't like to talk about it, but it is impossible for America to allow what is happening to Philadelphia and East St. Louis, Illinois, little place, it's places where young kids are hanging out without any hope. The only economy there is a drug economy where kids are selling rock and crime is taking place. Infant mortality rates are rising. AIDS going through the roof. Healthcare needs unmet. And feel comfortable and safe. That kind of devastation spills over everywhere. And it is impossible for America to be a strong America with this escalation of devastation. Hopefully, we can tell the story better of this devastation. In Los Angeles and in other places around the country, we've not been able to tell the story of police brutality, for example. One videotape and a graphic depiction of an awful beating was able to tell the story. Maybe we can take members of Congress to the Bronx. Maybe we can take them to Philadelphia. Maybe we can take them to Watts. I don't know, but I think the story hasn't gotten through to them, how bad it really is. I think that we're working in a vacuum oftentimes, and we're too far removed from the harsh realities of what's going on in these cities. If I was any American in America today, I would be frightened about it. So I'm prepared not to stick to one way of telling the story, of trying to convince and influence. I'll do anything. I will describe it in whatever way makes good sense in order to get the attention that's so desperately needed. I just don't think this administration can continue in its efforts to wipe its hands of the problem and to block grant it out to the states. I don't know why 15 is a popular number tonight, but the $15 billion, $12 to $15 billion that I mentioned is the same $15 billion that we had in revenue sharing before they did away with that. It's the same $15 billion we're talking about turning back to the states with responsibility for all these categorical programs. So whatever framing it takes that the best minds could come up with, I'm prepared to carry the story in that way. I'm not wedded to any one way of doing it.
Sunny?
The responses here were dealing with federal policy toward the states. I'd just like to shift the focus back to the states and make a few brief comments. Even when the federal government was at its height in providing assistance to cities, state government provided much more assistance to the cities. In addition, the work that John Yinger and I have done showed that states targeted their assistance, where assistance is broadly defined to include both monetary aid and other forms of sort of institutional assistance. States targeted assistance more effectively toward the cities that needed it the most than the federal government was able to do. My worry about putting too much emphasis on the federal government now, even though I'm in favor of putting some, is that where we'll end up is, if we end up with any additional aid at all, is an aid program that disperses aid very broadly among huge numbers of cities and localities, that we won't target the aid to the cities that need it the most. I think that at this stage in our development of federalism, that it's important for the cities to work as closely as they can with the state governments to work out partnerships to deal with a lot of the inequities that we now face within metropolitan areas, where we have a central city like Philadelphia, which is in serious fiscal condition, but we've got a lot of other areas, other communities in the metropolitan area that are in strong fiscal condition. All the fairness arguments, all the economic strength sorts of arguments that Mayor Flynn was making apply even more strongly at the state-local level than they do, I think, at the national level.
The state, by the same token, let me just add this point if I can. The states are also willing, and more recently, are willing to allow the cities to assume all these social problems in programs for poor and working needy people. Let me give you an example. In Boston, we are 9% of the population of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, roughly. We have 2/3 of all homeless beds in the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, I'm proud of that Boston and its neighbors are willing to open their doors in their neighborhoods for programs to assist socially needy people. And we will go out into neighborhood meetings and convince and talk to the people how important it is to set up a shelter or a halfway house for troubled kids or for people with drug problems. And so that's not a problem. The problem we have, however, is that many people in the suburbs are not only happy for us to assume those kind of responsibilities, they are also, however, not willing to provide any dollars or any resources to provide programs for those kind of needs. So I'd just like to see a little bit of consistency there. If they want to stop the social programs in those particular communities, at least give us the dollars or the wherewithal to deal with those issues.
So far, we've focused the discussion primarily on federal and state aid policies. Senator DuPont, though, called our attention to the regulatory federalism dimension, that is, the dimension of placing mandates and restrictions on lower levels of government without providing money for that. And I guess the question I'd like to ask the panel to consider next before we go to the audience for questions is how far do you think we could address the problems of the cities by relaxing some of the restrictions and the mandates from higher levels of government, both on the side of mandating services and on the side of being more permissive about what taxation could occur at lower levels of government? I wonder if any of the panelists would care to take that up. Senator?
Well, I think that obviously is an interesting aspect to the whole problem that we face. It's been my bone of contention that where we presently find ourselves is partially driven by the fact that we've been willing to accept what the federal government has given us. As I look at how the next 10 years play out, for New Hampshire, and I know we don't face the problems of California or Massachusetts, that we still lack, and I don't care whether it's a large city or a small city, the ability to help those cities with the very basic needs that they're going to face. And that includes things like cleaning up our rivers, cleaning up our water supplies, doing all of those things that we no longer have the capacity to do. And when we start talking about whether the states are going to be the rescuers of the cities, I think we've gotten beyond that point, because I think we've let our infrastructure get to the point where it's going to take more than the state's capacity to try and deal with those problems. To me, the whole issue boils down to that there is no leadership on the national level to help the cities, and that there is not the political will to fix them. I don't think there's a question in my mind that the American people don't understand the plight of the cities. I just don't think that anybody's willing to step up to the plate and say it's time to fix it, put the dollars necessary behind it to do it. And certainly, as I said earlier in the evening, I think the last job that I would want is the mayor of a large city.
What about the political will, though, to relax some of the mandates and to allow the localities to tax if they have the political will to do it at their own level?
Well, I wouldn't have any problem with that, because I think clearly, and we discussed this earlier, that given the fact that that you have to establish that there is a level at which taxation points your economy in the opposite direction, which we all don't want to reach, that Boston has some problems that are specific to Boston, that if the state's unwilling to help it with its problems, then Boston has to be innovative in creating solutions for itself. So that's something that I think as we go through the next decade, that if we're going to get serious about how we're going to fix the things that need to be fixed, that those types of things are going to have to be considered. Either that or Congress is going to get responsible and start looking at what it's going to do to help put our cities and our states back into good fiscal shape, because I think the next 10 years are going to be difficult for all of the states, because the problem is no longer just the economy. It's structural. It's not going to be fixed by a turning around in our economy.
Mayor Flynn, in Massachusetts, the cities not only are constrained from levying sales taxes and income taxes and earnings taxes, but of course since Proposition 2.5 they're severely constrained on the side of the property tax as well. Do you think that if the state legislature were more open to allowing you to determine your own tax policies, you could make much headway toward addressing the problems of the city of Boston?
No, there's no question about it in my mind, and that's something that I've been working on for the last 6-7 years very, very actively. And as a matter of fact, I met with a number of key leaders throughout the state of Massachusetts today for that specific purpose. Again, it's a basic question of fairness and equity. Boston, again, generates is 9% of the state's population, but generates about 26% of all the revenue that goes to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So clearly, we do not get our fair share of revenue. And despite the fact that we have 52% of our property is tax exempt in all these major colleges, including Harvard, I might add.
I guess the medical school.
Well, the medical school and the business school and Harvard Stadium, and they're all wonderful institutions, but they don't pay taxes to the city of Boston. And all these beautiful medical facilities, and by the way, state government itself is 23% of all tax-exempt property in the city of Boston, and the economic engine that generates the jobs for Massachusetts. Boston plays that key role. So I would be very happy if the amount of money that is generated in the city of Boston stayed in Boston, and we'll let the people up at the State House try to figure out how they're going to support the rest of government. And but that's what needs to be done here. If they're going to cut back on local aid, and they're going to cut back on their commitment to the cities and towns of Massachusetts, then what they then should do is they should give the local communities the structural opportunity, the mechanism in which to provide the revenues to support those level of services. I believe that the people of the capital city of Massachusetts would in fact support revenues, taxes, if they knew what were going to provide services such as police and education, fire, health care, and stimulate the economic health of Boston, create jobs. People would support that. What people don't support, however, is just sending sophisticated than that. I think people will support taxes if they believe they're going to be used for the economic health of the community, of the city, or it's going to be used to provide hope and opportunity for young kids in education, in public safety. I think people will, in fact, support those kind of mandated, earmarked programs.
I noticed that Sonny Ladd has a comment on this. Before you speak, Sonny, let me mention that right after she does speak, we'll be open to questions from the audience. We have microphones on either side of the seating area. If you'd like to ask a question, please go to one of the microphones and identify yourself as you ask the question. Sonny?
Just a brief comment on this issue of whether cities should be allowed to use additional taxes. For additional taxes, say a sales tax or an earnings tax, to help the city of Boston, it would be important that some of the revenue from these additional taxes be paid ultimately by non-residents of the city. In other words, part of the burden would be exported to non-residents, say tourists coming into the city paying some of the sales taxes, or commuters coming into the city. In my book with John Yinger, we actually come out in favor of earnings taxes or payroll taxes for a lot of cities that are facing fiscal distress, provided that those payroll taxes include as part of the base the earnings generated in the city accruing to commuters. The idea is to include the commuters in the support of the city services.
How many cities have payroll taxes?
Well, 20 out of 71 cities nationally. Interestingly, of the 5 cities that we discovered were in the poorest fiscal condition, the 6 cities in the poorest fiscal condition, 5 are currently allowed to use earnings taxes as a way to generate some revenue.
You say 20 out of 71. There were 71 in the sample you studied?
In our sample of cities nationally, yes.
Right.
Thank you.
Good. Yes, sir. Please identify yourself as you ask the question.
I'm an undergraduate in the college. For decades, we've heard about the different demographic and economic conditions in different parts of the country, most notably the shift in jobs and population from the Northeast to the South and West. So far, you've all spoken as if fiscal problems are uniform across the country. I'd like to know how urban fiscal crises differ interregionally and how the mechanisms to deal with these fiscal crises differ interregionally.
Professor Ladd has been studying that, I know.
Well, I've been studying it by living in the South. I'm from the North, but I now live in the South. I live in North Carolina. I teach at Duke, and it's interesting. The North Carolina cities in general are in much stronger fiscal condition than a lot of the northeastern cities. This shouldn't surprise you. As you know, Boston cannot annex the areas around the city of Boston, much as it might like to annex wealthy communities like Milton or Brookline or whatever. The growth in the southern cities and a number of the western cities has been quite different. As the cities have grown and people have moved out from the central city into areas around the city city itself has grown. It has annexed those surrounding areas, and that has helped a lot in terms of dealing with some of these fiscal pressures that we've been talking about.
Historically, of course, annexation works till you run into the next city. The great thing about the South and the West is they have a lot of those wide open spaces.
That's right.
Right? Before you run into the next city. Anybody else care to comment on that question?
I might just add that some of the cities in not all the cities in poorest fiscal condition in our study are in the Northeast. New Orleans always ends up in our low fiscal health category, and a number of other cities do as well.
But you mentioned in your earlier remarks that in general the cities of the South and the West tend to be in better fiscal health than those of the Northeast and Midwest.
That's right. One has to be a little careful in generalizing, but that's right.
But is that not because I guess the description of what has happened in like the Rust Belt with the closing of factories and plants that manufactured and the South and Southwest more high-tech and new type service industry jobs providing employment opportunities that do not exist in some of the older cities?
Yeah. Well, some of it is just the general economic growth. I mean, you could name, I suspect, the cities that come out in the worst fiscal distress in our cities. I mean, in our study. I mean, it's the New York, Newark, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, and a number of those are losing population, some of them gaining jobs in the service sector, but not in manufacturing, whereas the southern cities are still experiencing rapid growth along a lot of dimensions.
My name is Kathleen Conroy. I'm at the Kennedy School. I'm wondering to what extent, if at all, the lack of coordination between city, state, and federal government is being met by increasing coordination on a regional level. And specifically, I'd be curious to hear Professor Ladd talk about the city-suburban relationship and the likelihood, if at all, for a greater regional cooperation, perhaps on a county basis.
I don't see a lot of evidence of regional cooperation. In my area of Durham, we have 3 cities. We have Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. We desperately need regional coordination of transportation, and we have not yet achieved that. Fortunately, last year we regionalized our telephone system to make it a little easier to call from one part of the metropolitan area to another.
We regionalize our private services, not our public services. Right?
But I'm not optimistic about that. It is, you mentioned counties, though, at the end. You know, the New England states are quite special in having the counties play such a limited role in the delivery of public services. In my state of North Carolina, and in most states throughout the country, counties play a much larger role in providing redistributive sorts of services. The advantage of that is you have a unit of government that's larger than the municipality or the town or city that we have in Massachusetts that can service the basis for local taxation. So we have local sales taxes at the county level, for example, in North Carolina. It's hard to do that in Massachusetts because we have our separate 351 cities and towns.
Yes.
John Walker with the Kennedy School program. Going to the mayor's point about the economic engine, it's been my observation working with local governments over the years that we do a very poor job of sitting down with the business leaders of the community and talking about the fundamental success of an economy based upon local government services. And I believe that many business leaders are very concerned about the ability of towns and cities to function, provide rudimentary services, including education for their children. I kind of wonder if we fail to grab these people in the Chamber of Commerce boardroom, sit down and really talk to them about we're losing our ability to function. Any comments on that?
Well, yeah, I do, because it's something that I watch very carefully. I do think there is an increasing interest in education. I think all of the evidence is in now that there will not be people to fill the jobs of the future unless we educate our young folks. I think the business community finally understands that, and the business community is getting more involved in some states in helping to be about the business of education reform. In California, for example, one of the members of the legislature just resigned his job to go to work with the Downtown Business Association, who will be looking at ways by which they can work with the LA Unified School District in reforming education, even the state in some ways, and I'm very pleased about that. One thing that really shocked and surprised me is I took some time out to look at the Jobs Employment Partnership Training Act and how it works. And I spent a lot of time at the state level prior to being elected dissecting that program, because I was very unhappy about the way it was not working in the city of Los Angeles. And it was working so poorly in the city of Los Angeles that the city of Los Angeles had unspent somewhere in the neighborhood of $20–30 million over a period of a few years. And young people standing out on the corners begging for job training, some opportunities to grab a hold of their lives. What I discovered was JEPTA had been put together at the federal level Dan Quayle was involved. I think Senator Kennedy was involved with JEPTA. And it replaced the old CETA programs. Now, many of us loved CETA and the way it worked, and we thought a lot of good came out of it. But the idea of JEPTA was to involve the business community, because the business community knows better how to train. And this program has private industry councils that are formed by the cities and the counties to make sure that the business community is in there telling the cities and the counties how to train people. Guess what has happened with JEPTA? Nothing. Zilch. Zero. The private industry councils meet. The business persons come to these meetings. I don't know what they do because it is a failure across this country. So I'm surprised that the opportunity was created in federal policy for business involvement at a very basic level, and it didn't happen. And I don't know what you do to make that happen, but I think it's an area where I had anticipated, even though I didn't want to see CETA ended, that, well, if we have to be involved with job training this way, we'll now learn how to do OJT, on-the-job training, because the private industry councils are going to grab a hold of these programs, and they're going to show us how to train people on the job and get people working. It hasn't happened, but I'm open. I'll even go to a Chamber of Commerce meeting to try and talk with the business community about its involvement in new and different ways.
Senator, you care to comment at all on this?
Well, I would just add that I feel a little bit uncomfortable because we don't share the distrust of the business community in New Hampshire. In fact, they participate in much of what we do, and perhaps that's because of the way we govern in New Hampshire, that many of us come out of the business community, so we don't have that wall that separates our government officials from the business community. And not just in education, but in many other areas in New Hampshire, the business community is part of the process and part of the solution, as is the nonprofits and any other group that's interested in what state government does. I found it amazing that when we were talking earlier that we find that the city of Boston has difficulty getting its state government to listen, when in fact when the mayor of the largest city in New Hampshire calls, I don't ask him what time he's coming in. I tell him what time I'm coming down, because we seem to be much more responsive to what the leaders of our state are looking for. So, I guess I would just say that, it's a question of the business community has to get involved, and I share the concerns about where we're going with the quality of our workforce, and that's something that definitely has gotten the interest of the business community. But we perhaps aren't doing our job in bringing them into the process in a way in which they feel that they can accomplish something.
Yes.
Arlene Kirsch, I'm from the Mid-Career Program. I'd like to say that we've talked about, on the federal level, the reduction in aid since about 1978, which was, I think, the peak year, and we've talked about federally mandated programs that are unfunded. We haven't really talked at all about the difference between on-budget and off-budget allocations. I think right now the biggest off-budget allocation is the price tag for the Gulf War, and it used to be social welfare programs. There's been a big shift to having those be on-budget programs, I think, since the Reagan presidency, and I'd like the panel to address this other process that nobody really talks about.
Well, let me just say, from the limited time that I've been in Congress, this very, very important public policy-making body is a body of politicians. And I've watched measures get to the floor with all of the rules waived and off-budget concerns taken up very quickly and passed because the war was popular and the members felt they had the support of the public, and they pander to that. Politicians, unfortunately, do those things that they believe they have support for. And all that has happened with the Gulf War, people have been rushing to show how supportive they are. And if you voted against the war, the most popular thing to do is to show how you love the soldiers or how much you really didn't mean it. And so whether it's off-budget supplemental allocations for hardware or, as I pushed, for supplemental allocations for soldiers and taking care of some of their social service needs, that's really what's happening when you see off-budget. I mean, it's popular. It's what politicians run for re-election on. I mean, that's really what it's all about.
What you're saying is we have a budget agreement, but we waive it when politicians see that it's in their advantage to waive it. And that means, of course, not just the war, but the S&L crisis.
Absolutely.
Has been off budget as well.
I sat there and I watched the debate and was part of the debate on funding for the Resolution Trust Corporation. And they got that $30 billion, and they're going to get $50 billion more. And it goes on and on and on. It gets rather convoluted. And without going into all of the details about who emerges to talk about who's hurt and who's not hurt in this kind of issue, you're right. I mean, Congress takes off budget whatever it wants to take off budget. Politicians do whatever they feel is in the best interest of their careers for the most part. And unfortunately, that's what you're seeing.
Yes, sir.
Okay. My name is Jeffrey Livingston. I'm an undergraduate. And as I've sat and watched the discussion, I've entered the very dangerous realm of trying to understand the policy discussion in the frame of some realities that I see. One of those being competition between states and between cities. My home is Columbia, South Carolina, and my father works for a company that 2 years ago was headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts, and my mother works for a company that 6 months ago was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And you mentioned, for instance, New Orleans, and New Orleans has a 9.5% sales tax. So when I am hopefully getting a job and looking at where I'm going to live, New Orleans is not going to be attractive to me. It seems to me that the big cities with the most problems that increase the taxes that is not going to do it, because those of us with mobility, those of us who would be paying the majority of the taxes, are going to leave. I don't think that as a student I could afford to move into downtown Boston when I graduate from here, or it wouldn't be in my economic best interest to do so. What is it that the cities and the states are going to do in light of those kinds of realities? Why aren't more businesses going to move from Boston to Rochester, New Hampshire, for instance, and what happens when they do?
Sunny?
I think you've really hit it, the heart of the issue, and everything you've said is, I believe, consistent with what I was trying to say. Without additional outside assistance from higher levels of government for our cities, the only solution, the only way that cities can cope is to balance their budgets, which is what they're required to do by law, is to reduce service levels, which is going to scare people away. Firms care about service levels, people care about service levels, or to raise taxes, which is going to keep out or going to make it more difficult for people like you and other sorts of people that we'd like to have live in our inner cities from living there. So that's a strong argument, I think, consistent with the type of argument that I was making for additional assistance for our inner cities.
If I could respond, I think it gets back to one of the things that the mayor pointed out, that the economic well-being of Massachusetts is based on the city of Boston being healthy. And although being from New Hampshire, and we like to spend a lot of our time taking shots at the state of Massachusetts, the fact of the matter is southern New Hampshire has been successful because of the growth that has been stimulated as a result of what comes out of Boston, the intellectual product of this city, and the educational institutions have been the primary reason why we have been so successful. New Hampshire has been successful in the past because it's had an edge. It's had low land costs, lower wages, a lower tax structure. And I think when you look at this whole issue of how do we make our cities healthy again, you have to restore the edge to those communities. And they can't do that if they have to find those solutions within. And unfortunately, as we look at this whole issue, I get real angry when we start framing public policy questions strictly on the basis of whether they're good politics or not. It's time that the political leaders in this country start focusing on what's good public policy, and if they do what's good public policy, the politics will take care of themselves. You don't lead by trying to demonstrate to people that you're more concerned with your re-election 2 years from now than what's good for the people that you represent. And you don't do it by having press conferences every day to tell people what you're doing. You go out and do it, and that's how you fix things. And, that's the challenge.
Congresswoman, would you say that there's a difference here between part-time and full-time politicians in this view? Do you find that in Congress very much?
No, what I would say is that there's not a lot of courage. Politicians don't have a lot of courage. They cannot talk about the needs of their cities and their states in a real way because they are looking over their shoulders for their re-election efforts. I think that this administration in Washington is doing a terrible disservice to all of us in the way that it is handling this whole question of block grants and the way it handles, and starting with the Reagan administration, the way it handled dealing with the needs of people and the separating out of the phrasing of the truly needy as opposed to the needy, and the cutting back of housing by 75%. Let me just tell you something. The cities will never be able to afford to continue to take care of its homeless with temporary shelters. We should do away with the temporary shelter building because it's structural. And we have got to get the funding, and the only place it's going to come from is the federal government to do a number of things. All of the homeless people need social services. They need to be staffed. Where do these people come from? What are their needs? Some of them are veterans out there who have can be taken care of through that system. Some of them can be taken care of through other systems. We need to staff them. It's going to cost money to do that in very innovative and creative ways. We need to have housing proposals that deal with the needs of the homeless. Everything from creative, innovative housing to deal with single males to families that are on the street. That's only going to come from the federal government. But if the President of the United States continues to fan the fear flames all over the place with telling people that their tax dollars are going to truly unneedy people, that federal government does not need to be involved in taking care of human needs, then politicians are going to follow that. I mean, if he appears to be successful with it, then other politicians are going to identify with that. And it would be absolutely marvelous and wonderful if politicians didn't do that. But they aren't prepared to talk about taxes in any real way because they're afraid they won't be reelected to office.
Afraid we only have time for one more question. And
Thank you. My name is Diane Wilkerson, and I like the previous person who put the question to you, I'm sitting here and sat through dinner trying to distinguish what I'm hearing from what I know to be reality and what I see. And I'd like to just offer an observation and put a question to you. Throughout the supper conversation, as I was here for dinner, and through this conversation, except for the references, which Congressman Waters made several times, by the way, to the changing diversity of our major cities and what that changing diversity means in terms of response. No one else mentioned that. And that's significant to me because this country doesn't look the way it looked 10 years ago. And 5 years from now, it won't look the way it looks right now. It's getting increasingly darker, and the needs are different. And part of the problem is we're trying to put the same Band-Aid on a different kind of sore and the same remedy on a different kind of ailment. It's not working. And to the extent that we don't at least be upfront about what the problem is, then it's not going to be fixed. So we have that's the discussion. I heard people keep saying poor and needy, and perhaps racial minorities. It's not a perhaps. That's the real deal. That's what this country looks like now. It's going to be even more so. And I was really afraid that the mayor wouldn't be sitting in that seat by the time I got up to the mic, and sure enough, he wasn't. But this, what happens is, I think, on the federal state level is that the federal government pulling away from the states and then the states pulling away from the cities is becoming the same kind of distraction that the Gulf War was to the federal government to get away from talking about a domestic policy. The fact is, in our best of times, people of color in this country had nothing. The change is that there are now more people of color in those cities who have nothing. When the city of Boston was at its peak, we had the highest black infant mortality death rate in the country, and we are number 19 right now, and if you factor out of that factor white infant mortality, we become the worst in the nation. It's not about money, because we've been talking a lot about all these beautiful institutions and the medical institutions we have. We talked about the economic health. Our mental health is in trouble. So the economic health could never work. And if we're not honest about that, you know, my fear is that if we talk about the remedy being people being fair and moral and compassionate, that's just as much as saying it's never going to happen, and we could all just pack up, because that's just not going to happen. My suggestion would be that the people who do believe that they want to do the right thing, to do it. You know, the reality is that we distribute money in the city of Boston just like the federal government distributes it to the state, and the state distributes it to us. We talk about monies that get distributed to the city of Boston to deal with crime or infant mortality. We get the smallest amount for this largest city, and then the black community gets the smallest amount. You can't have an infant mortality policy that distributes money all over the city, because we don't have an infant mortality problem all over the city. And this notion that every community ought to get some because I'm the mayor of all the city, it's crazy. We don't have an infant mortality problem in general. We have a black infant mortality problem.
Would you like the panel to comment on that?
I would.
All right.
I've been waiting since dinner, so I mean, it's just, I was hoping that somebody would say this, and it hasn't happened yet.
Thank you very much.
Well, let me just say, and I'm going to say this so that the others, and I'm going to say it quickly, can get a word in here. When I said to the mayor, I'm willing to talk about it in any way that will cause us to do the right thing, I meant that, because there are some of us
I know you meant
who
it.
feel like we're on the cutting edge of the issue, and we're going to do that. We're going to talk about the problems of racism. We're going to talk about the problems of the growing diversity and what is happening to the inner cities. But the trend is to try and get you not to do it. The trend is to say you're not mainstream. And if you watch what is developing nationally, and you listen to, for example, Doug Wilder, you know, the great thing is to fashion your arguments in such a way that no one can say you're being disproportionately favorable to people of color, those who happen to need the services most. I know what that game is, and I understand it, and I allow in my own way other people to do whatever they feel is necessary to get the job done. If the end results would be the same, then it would be all right with me. But let me just say to you that you're absolutely correct, and there are those of us who are not going to move away from saying it and describing it in ways that we understand it and know it to be. And some of us who are very, very worried that these inner cities are going to be left increasingly with majority, minority, even majority, minority politicians in some case, with no tax base, little alliances or relationships at the state level or the federal level, and campaigns from the national level that will be Willie Horton designed to frighten people about the fact that either blacks are criminals or blacks, African Americans, and others are causing all of the problems in society and costing everybody money. And so I know exactly where you're coming from and what is happening, but there are some of us who will continue to work on it.
Well, you know, I guess I go back to my original comments about having the ability to move on the basis of what's good public policy. You know, your earlier remarks about the fact that the reality of the way this country is changing, what this country is going to look like 10 years from now, and this may sound strange coming from New Hampshire, which is the smallest percentage of minorities in the country. This morning in Manchester, New Hampshire, I spoke at a BIA, which is our Business and Industry Association in New Hampshire, a forum talking about diversity in the workplace, which most people in New Hampshire have never heard or even discussed, looking at what our workforce is going to look like 10 years from now. We're spending all our time worrying about creating jobs, but we're not spending our time worrying about who is the individual that's going to fill those jobs. And I came away from that this morning understanding a little bit more about what this country is going to look like 10 years from now and 20 years from now, and understanding that even New Hampshire, which lags behind the rest of the country, is going to go through the same changes in terms of who are the people of this country in the year 2010. So I think there's an awareness building. However, I get back to the premise that Boston should have political capital. It should be able to be heard by the leaders of this community and the leaders of the state, and that for our cities, which have been the hub of all our economic opportunity in past years, to now walk away from them is irresponsible.
I'd like to thank both the panel and our questioners for some very provocative and interesting remarks this evening on one of the most difficult sets of issues that we face in this country. Thank you all.